203, welcome to the Beekly. We are going to get started right on time here. So I'm going to share my screen and let's talk about an introduction to the TCFD. So I have the Q&A open. I got the chat open. I believe I need to enable chat. There we go, which I messed up before, but you live and you learn. So if you have any questions, thoughts, please throw them in there. So introduction to the TCFD, here's a little bit about what we're going to talk about. Quick introduction as to who we are and why we're talking about this. We'll share a history of the TCFD, what they actually expect and what is required, show a few metrics for early success, and what regulations have come out of the TCFD, a bit about the future. This will talk about something called the IFRS S2, because one thing we're all missing in this world is another delicious acronym. And then a little bit about how Beehive helps. If you have any questions, you can use the little Q&A button or put them into the chat and we'll go from there. So let's get started with who we are. So my name is Adriel. I'm the founder of a company called Beehive. Beehive does what is called enterprise climate risk management. So we help you understand your financial exposure to climate disasters, publish your TCFD or IFRS report, whatever you want to call it, depending on how trendy you are, and do all of that work in a really great software. I'll show you a little bit more of in a bit. Let's talk about the history. So the TCFD was launched in 2017. It was launched by Mark Carney, who was the chair of something called the Financial Stability Board. He used to be the governor of the Bank of England, and you might know his name from the news because he has actually become the Prime Minister of Canada. So yeah, I'm sure his parents are very proud. Does a lot. So Mark Carney and Michael Bloomberg were involved in launching the TCFD. Michael Bloomberg, New York mayor, founder of Bloomberg, very failed presidential candidate. Quite a fun debate if anyone remembers 2020. And so they launched this. They launched this thing called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And it was basically a research effort to understand how does the financial community assess the impact of natural disasters and of climate change to make better investors. There's a lot I can show in here, but I wanted to point out a couple things. The first is this is from 2017, but they talk about these three groupings of risks. And I want to point these out because they're fairly prescient. Two of these three is exactly what they have stuck with over time. They talk about physical risks. So, what is the impact from weather related events? Liability risks. So, who gets sued if something happens or what insurance companies need to do? And transition risks. So, what financial risks exist from changing society due to climate change? If new laws get passed, if there are new market expectations, and your portfolio company, if you're an investor, or actual company, if you manage a business, are unable to respond well, what are the related risks? So I thought that was really, really well done. And their goal was basically to just organize this work that was already happening. Climate risk as a concept is not a new thing. Weather has been a issue since we first sailed on expeditions in the 1500s. And boy, if actually the the middle-aged Italians and Portuguese knew when storms would come in certain seasons, and they would not, and they mapped this stuff, and they would not send ships on certain voyages in certain times of year to limit their climate-related financial risk. And so all fast forward 500 years and modeling got a little better in the mid 20th century for agriculture firms and real estate firms and insurance companies. Weather and climate were very serious issues. And then now, with the admission that, oh, hot take, but climate change might be slightly measurable or slightly predictable, and maybe we even know some of the causes of climate change. I know, hot take, very spicy stuff here. There's a way to actually manage your financial exposure to these issues. And so that was the goal of the TCFD. 2 years later, Michael Bloomberg and Mark Carney, what a smile on this guy, came out and they basically just gave a little announcement that says, where are we 2 years after beginning this effort? And I just love this line here where 237 companies with a combined market cap of $6.3 trillion have publicly committed to the TCFD. That was 150 financial firms with assets under $81 trillion and many, many other companies. And I want to really emphasize this, especially in this political moment, because so much of sustainability and ESG work is very much of the question, of the Milton Friedman like question of is the business of business just business? And the political conversation is Do companies have a responsibility to anything except for their shareholders and their bottom line? And I'm not going to weigh in on that one here, but I will say the goal of the TCFD is to say that climate risk is something relevant in the short term to the shareholders and to the bottom line. It is not an ethereal, hard to understand 2050 issue that hippie firms might care about and others don't. It is a material financial issue. If your factory or the home of your CEO or your largest supplier gets hit by a hurricane, that is a material financial issue. And all that the TCFD is doing and all the regulations surrounding it is saying, we want to understand your exposure to issues like this. And they got a lot of private sector support very early on for this. So let's talk about what is involved, what they expect of companies who are doing this TCFD report. So TCFD proposed 4 sections and 11 questions to help investors standardize how they look at climate-related financial risk. And those 4 sections were governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And across these 4 questions, across these 4 sections, there were 11 questions that asked who in your company has oversight of these risks? What is your strategy to understand these risks? Once you understand them, how do you manage them? And how do you actually make sure they don't affect your business? And what metrics and targets do you have to try to mitigate these potential risks? Fairly standard language in the context of all risk management. And risk management touches upon geopolitical risks, cybersecurity risks, risks of terrorism, risks of civil unrest, all those risks have these same structures. And so climate risks are being brought into this same exact structure. And so I want to just continue to emphasize for anyone trying to figure out how to talk about this internally at their company or communicate about this is not about fitting risk into the climate bucket. It's about bringing climate into the risk bucket. And risk is a well-established series of taxonomies inside of companies for a very long time. So bring climate into that. Now, what you actually need to do to write this report and answer these questions is basically a physical risk assessment. So what is your exposure to disasters? A transition risk assessment, which is, are you set up for an economy that'll change due to climate change? And you need to write this report. And so this is what some of these reports look like. Some are beautiful. So this is HubSpot's. It is lovely, but you'll see they have that same structure of governance is the section, strategy is a section, risk management is a section, metrics and targets is a section, and then those questions underneath it. Now, HubSpot went way ahead and they built this out, and they also included a lot of detail about what risks that they've identified. And they really went into a lot of detail in an appendix here, which is not the traditional approach, but it is a very advanced approach. Take-Two Interactive is a really cool gaming company, and they also did a beautiful job, which from a design perspective makes sense. A gaming company is very visual, but this is what they looked at. But yours doesn't have to be like this. If you're thinking about this and you're like, oh my goodness, like I have to get my design team involved. This is beautiful. You don't have to. It is GitLab, very simple, boxes and squares and risks and text. And Pinterest, even simpler, shorter, just 3 pages of what their risks are. So a few options for you to do this work. So let's ask ourselves the question, was the TCFD a successful effort? Was it a waste of time? Did it fall apart? Didn't stick around? There's this report that the TCFD organization released, I think, every year, and their most recent one was in 2023. And I pulled aside a few charts from here. So they reviewed results from 2020 to 2022, and a couple interesting things here. The average number of disclosures has gone up, almost doubled, which means the amount that a company who does disclose did disclose went way up. And the number of companies who disclosed more things over time went way up. So a huge percentage of companies disclosed at least one risk. Very few disclosed all 11. But for the first time in 2022, there were companies who disclosed all 11 risks. So the number of risks people are disclosing went way up. You can also see in this chart, based on the question and the industry, who disclosed what. So I see a few of those people on this call are mostly in the technology industry. So you can look at this second to last column here as the percentage of technology and media businesses who disclose their response to that particular question. You'll see it's kind of low in the middle. I think across the board, the strategy and the risk management sections are the lowest, but especially low for technology and media companies. It was very high on metrics and targets, which makes sense. Technology, very data-driven industry. And also many people here in their disclosure talk about carbon emissions, and a lot of people in technology have been measuring emissions for a long time. And then a good percentage relatively disclosed governance oversight. And that's because these are relatively large companies. We'll talk about that in a moment, I think, who are disclosing this, and they have set up boards, established committees around the risk management. So yeah, disclosure by company size. So you'll see here, obviously, larger companies had more to disclose because they had a lot of this effort already set up. So that's helpful. But even smaller companies at less than $3 billion in market cap did a pretty good job disclosing. About it was 40% on average for the questions. Some questions reached 60% disclosures, and the lowest one around resilience had a 5% disclosure. But this resilience question was the lowest disclosed across the board. Even very large companies who did a very good job disclosing almost every answer. Very few of them disclosed on resilience. One more way to slice this is specifically in North America. There's other charts in this report about how European companies disclose on this, and as you might imagine, the disclosure was much higher. But in North America, disclosure was fairly high. So you can see, again, we'll focus on technology and media because those are most of the people on this call. But of this assessment, which was done not on every disclosure ever, I think it was a N of about 1,100. About 180 of them were technology companies, and they ranged. The smallest one had 30 million in revenue. The largest one had 400 billion in revenue. Um, Salesforce, if they're that large, or someone similar. Um, and then the median was about 700 million in revenue, which actually lines up fairly well to the kinds of companies who are beginning to disclose right now. Because if you look at the California regulation that most people here are probably most interested in, so we'll talk about that in a second, but actually we can talk about that now. So California SB 261 regulation is this one, says that by January 1st, 2026, any company with 500 million in revenue in the United States doing business in California needs to publish its TCFD aligned report. So this $700 million median threshold from a couple years ago is kind of right around the sort of company that is beginning to look at climate risk today. And as you think about success, one way to think about success in this policy universe is that, as everything, this starts as a policy effort. So a bunch of think tanks or smart people get together and say, hey, I think the world would be a better place, or my industry would be a better industry if this thing existed. And I spent a few years trying to make this thing exist and educate regulators on why this thing should exist and how it should exist and informing them. The real question is, does this get codified into law? That is how you know it is legit. This chart over here shows you a bunch of the countries that have laws already in effect around climate-related financial risk, and some that have bills being considered. And this is last updated about 4 months ago, so it's fairly accurate, although now it is missing a bunch of bills. So you can see California has this climate rule, Brazil, Europe, China, Nigeria. They're missing Hong Kong, or maybe I just got to click the button somehow, but Hong Kong's in here. Japan, this bill is actually now a law. Australia, this bill is actually now a law. So it is really developing and covering a lot of the country. In Canada, this was a kind of voluntary effort. Now Mark Carney as prime minister, who can read the tea leaves, but I sort of expect that this would be a more required effort fairly soon for Canadian companies. So this has been codified into law in a lot of places. Now let's look at the future. Where's this headed? Is there anything else? There you go. I want to talk about two other things here around success. Or one other thing. I love this line from Michael Bloomberg in 2023, and this comes from this report I showed you, which is the success of these recommendations can be demonstrated by 19 jurisdictions accounting to 60% of the total GDP who have proposed or finalized these disclosures. And almost 5,000 organizations have indicated their support. So Michael Bloomberg realized that the value here can be proven or the success can be measured on the fact that many countries have codified this into law. And separately, much of the private sector is already reporting in line with TCFD. And so he was very proud of that 2-ish years ago. Now let's talk about the future. Sad to say, just like NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys and the Grateful Dead were the original band, the TCFD is no more. In October 2023, the TCFD, which was part of this thing called the FSB, was adopted by the IFRS Foundation's International Sustainability Standards Board. You might have seen IFRB or IFRS if you read anything about the European CSRD regulations, but these IFRS standards are an effort to say, hey, the world has been doing a good job creating rules over the last 10, 15, 20 years. We need to consolidate. So the IFRS are trying to take the best of everywhere and consolidate. And more regulations that are coming out around the world from Japan, Brazil, and elsewhere are adopting IFRS standards. And so the FSB was adopted by this thing called the IFRS S2. There's this thing from Harvard Law School, also about a year old, that asked the question of how different is TCFD from IFRS? Like if I've been thinking about TCFD for a while, I've been reporting on it, what net new stuff do I need to do to comply with IFRS? Well, they did an assessment and they find that overall, only 23% of it is the same. 26% of it are enhancements, and about 50% of it is net new requirements. That's a lot. That can be pretty scary. That's a pretty impressive set of net new requirements. I will add the caveat that the source here is ISS, which is a sustainability consultant, which makes their money by complicating things and saying that there's a lot of new stuff that is very, very difficult and complicated. But the example they give here of what is new is really not that high. So they might talk about, instead of just saying who is responsible for this, talk about how it's integrated into their work on the board level. Instead of just saying what climate related financial risks exist, give a little bit of information about how this impacts your existing investments. Instead of just saying that you have metrics related to climate risk management, talk about the percentage of assets vulnerable to these risks. And so it evolved a little bit. It's not as scary as some consultants want to make you think. So that is the story of the TCFD and its evolution into the IFRS. Now let's talk briefly about your options if you wanted to comply with this, or if you had to comply with this, what would you do? So like we said, there's really 3 things you have to do: physical risk assessment, transition risk assessment, and publish this report. And your traditional option is probably going to be a bunch of consultants coming in, doing a relatively time consuming and slow process of evaluating physical risk to a few of your offices, maybe a data center or two. And they take a few months to do that, come back with a 100-page deck with your options. Then around transition risk, they'll interview a dozen of your executives 3 times, spend 40 hours getting into the business, run away for 4 months, write up a report, send you this long report. And then once you've reviewed all this, which will take quite some time, they'll say, all right, great, I'm ready to write your IFRS report. They'll go away for another month or two, and they'll come back and they'll give you your IFRS report that you will then, of course, go in and edit, because no one, even best, don't know your business as well as you do. With Beehive, you can do all that stuff that normally takes 6 months and a lot of interviews and process and back and forth in a couple of minutes. So you can assess physical risk to offices, employees, data centers across multiple climate scenarios. So this is what wildfires in the United States look like. This is what flood in the United States looks like, or heat and scenarios. So this is what it'll look like in the long term. And this is what it looks like if climate change is really bad or kind of in between. And you can do this across geographies very, very easily. All of this has an audit trail. So you have a lot of confidence in anything you're reporting to your investors. So you know that why a score is what it is. We can also assess your transition risks. So we have a giant database of risks across all four of these categories, of opportunities across the five categories, and a large library pulled from hundreds of TCFD reports of your peers. And our software will automatically assess which ones are most likely to be relevant to you. And then you'll come in here and we'll assess, hey, we think that this is a medium horizon and a low risk level, or whatever we think. And then you will come in here and actually improve that. So it's a similar process to consulting. Consultant is going to take their best educated guess, and then you're going to say, well, actually, we think this is a much higher risk than you're saying, and we think it'll impact us sooner because there's some stuff you consultant don't know. And for this one, we actually don't even think this is relevant. So let's remove this one. And so there's a lot of ways you can actually work directly in here. And again, instead of taking 6 months, it all takes a couple of hours. And then we publish your report for you. So for all these questions, I should have cleared this here. Instead of waiting an additional 4 to 6 weeks for a consultant who's busy and has got a lot going on, and you can only type so many words per minute to write these responses for you. We go in here, AI drafts your answer based on everything we know about you directly in here. And we will come in. This is our team's job, and we will draft all of these answers here. And then we, our subject matter experts, will review them to make sure the AI didn't say anything silly. So you do get a human review here, which is of course very, very important. And then we share them with you. And what your process will be like is very similar to a consultant, where a consultant sends you this thing and you review it and you're like, I don't like this. I want to use different language. It's just too transparent. And benchmarking is a huge part of your job, because I'm sure your general counsel or chief legal officer or whomever will say, all right, this is a good answer, I think. I don't know. I'm not an expert. What did my peers say? And you'd probably open up 30 tabs, Google 30 TCFD reports, screenshot a bunch of things, put it into a PowerPoint, and share that. And then you'll be going back and forth between tabs. In Beehive, that happens all in here. So if Atlassian is a peer of yours, you can see how Atlassian answered every single one of these questions. And so you'll be able to say, hey, we want to be just like Atlassian, or we want to be a little bit better than ServiceNow for all these questions, or we want to make sure we're not as transparent as Workiva, because Workiva is sort of our ambitious version on ESG benchmarking. So whatever our answer is, let's make sure that it is not quite as developed as Workiva's, or however you want to do this. And all that happens directly in the software. So I hope that was fun. We talked a little bit about the history of the TCFD, how it's successful, what's expected, where it's evolved, and what you're required to do today. And then a bit about how Beehive makes all this much more accurate, data driven, and 1,000 times faster than a traditional consulting approach. There's a lot more in here that we won't get into today, but I'm happy to pause, take any question, see if there's something on your mind, whether it's inside of Beehive or about how peers are reporting or about the California law. Happy to dive into any of that. Stop sharing my screen here so I can see our little Q&A and our little chat. If you have any questions, you are welcome to ask them. We'll give it a minute or so in case the typing takes some time. Okay, cool. Glad that was helpful. I appreciate you all joining. Next week is going to be an amazing conversation with Patrick Flynn, who's a former chief sustainability officer of Salesforce for a long time, and now is maybe the best connected person in corporate sustainability. So join us next week, 2 p.m. on Thursday, for a very good conversation. Uh, Appreciate you all joining. Have yourself a lovely afternoon. Thank you and bye-bye.